All right. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. So, as I kind of alluded to last week, this semester is always a short one, just because Ramadan's in the middle of it, and we don't usually run any lectures throughout Ramadan. And I don't like to ruin people's post-Eid period, so I'm going to try and get the whole thing done within the January and February. There may be one session that has to happen sometime mid-April or so, but I'm going to try and get all the content in. So if I go a little bit over 9, don't get too upset. It's just to make sure that we don't have to, so Ramadan is smooth sailing for everyone, and then we don't have too much to cover afterwards. This course, it is seerah, but I'm using a different terminology because there's a difference between attending a seerah halaqah, where the sheikh just talks about the stories and kind of gets people to reflect upon them, which is obviously extremely important and an essential aspect of studying his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. But this is different. I'm going to go through studying seerah academically is a very different approach. So it's going to be 3 parts. So it's going to take a year to complete. The first part, which is what we're going to be doing in January and February, inshallah, maybe once or twice after Eid, is when we talk about the pre-Islamic era. Setting the context, because really it's almost, I believe that it's impossible to understand his seerah alayhi salatu wasalam, understand and study his biography appropriately, and understand the Quran for that matter, without having clarity on what was occurring prior to all that. Like, what was the context that he was born into alayhi salatu wasalam? What was the history? What were the norms that existed? What was the situation, the political, the geopolitical dynamics of that time? Because once you understand these a little bit better and you have that context, it becomes much easier for you to comprehend why the Arabs were the way they were and why certain things were occurring and why his struggles, alayhi salatu, were of that nature, especially when some of his struggles, some of them, I have to say, some of them, are very different than the struggles that we have today, meaning we don't necessarily always feel the relevance for all of the types of struggles that he's having alayhi salatu wasalam in his life, mainly because we just have a different life experience altogether. So last time I went through we talked a little bit about who the science of seerah, who's the first people who talked about it, what the sources are, and how those narrations, that hadith narrations and historic narrations are not dealt with the same way. So the scrutiny that a hadith undergoes does not necessarily apply to a historic narration. And that's important, because if you're going to treat every historic narration with the same scrutiny that you treat hadith, you end up with almost nothing. You almost no context at all. It becomes too difficult. The stories of what happened in life it comes through people. It is handed down generation by generation, and that's gathered. If you're going to use, you don't always have access to chains of narration that can be verified for all these stories. And that's an important piece. So sometimes I'll tell a story and you're like, well, I don't find the hadith for it. Well, you're going to find it in the books of seerah. And they may have a chain, but those chains don't undergo the same degree of scrutiny, and that's fine. That's always been the case. And it's not just this is not just how Islamic history is transmitted. It's how history in general is transmitted. The only difference, or the main difference that we have when it comes to these things, is that we have the Quran. So our history is governed by divine revelation. So you can't go, even if someone tells a story about his life, alayhi salatu wasalam, or he gives a context that's a little bit, he can't go too far off rails, because the Quran won't allow for it. You're bound by the book of Allah and what it's teaching, and that's why we have it preserved. That's why there's a certain degree of preservation of that period. There's almost no other historical events that occurred in the 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th and 10th century that have any degree of similarity in terms of how it is documented. Meaning the history of Europe during those years and the history of Europe centuries later are not even remotely as well documented as the 6th and 7th century of the Prophet ﷺ's life, and that happened afterwards. Because it became a habit, the Arab began documenting historical events, very, very, very closely. Mainly because of this of this science starting and then continuing. Because the way I look at it, the prophetic biography as a science is really also under the same umbrella. Islamic history is a part of that, because it's just the story continues. The story does not end with his passing away, alayhi salatu wasalam. It continues with the first khilafah and the second and third. So and that documentation continues. It's just that documentation, that history, doesn't have the governing book. So telling it is much more difficult. right? Telling you the story of the Khilafah Rashida and what happened is very difficult. Why? Because I don't have the governing text to hold everything together. So it becomes much more challenging to make sure that we're telling the story as objectively as possible and as unbiased as possible. All right. So today we're going to go through a few things, inshallah ta'ala, mostly so we're going to talk a little bit about the genealogy of the Arabs. It's very important because it has nothing to do with loving Arab. No, it's understanding how they existed in Arabia. So you understand why the Prophet ﷺ had some of the struggles. Some of these, once we're done through the next 2-3 sessions, there'll be a lot of moments where, okay, now I get it. Now I understand why Abu Jahl was like that. Now it makes perfect sense. Now I understand why al-Khattab was like that at the beginning. No, the element of not comprehending why goes away because this makes perfect sense. Obviously, he's going to feel that way because this is how it all works. They're going to carry with them the history. They carry with them the history of their parents and their tribes as they go along. So this text here is from a very, very old book written by Imam al-Asma'i. And within that, he breaks down the Arab into 3 groups. And I like it, and I put it here because I think it's an interesting way. So Asma'i wrote this book based on the Khalifa asking him to write something about the history of the Arabs prior to Islam and even with the first years of Islam. So he talked about the Arabs being three groups. The first one called al-Ba'ida. Al-Ba'ida means the group that is gone. Bada, they disappeared altogether. And he points out here that we don't have a lot of stories from that era. We don't really know much of what happened to them. And he points that there are 3 groups, Ad and Thamud and Jurhum al-Ula. Jurhum al-Ula. And I put this here just for this piece specifically. I didn't need this slide. I could just told you this without. But he points out Jurhum al-Ula. Jurhum al-Ula is different. There's Jurhum al-Thaniya. And they're the ones who are from the descendants of Qahtan who Ismail alayhi salam will later meet. Jurhum al-Ula predates Ibrahim alayhi salam by centuries. So, and they're different. And sometimes I find, and a lot of people who write in Sirah, and I read the book sometimes like, oh, you're not differentiating. You're talking about Jurhum, you're not differentiating between it's the same. One of the biggest challenges in studying Arab history, what do you think it is? It's the names. It's the same names. They use the same names, and some of the tribes have the same names. So if you don't know what you're doing, you'll hear the tribe of Kilab, and then you start talking about it, and you're talking about 2 tribes that lived in completely different areas centuries apart, and you're just mixing the story. And there have been mistakes to the point where a full production, a 30 or 40 episode musalsal that goes on TV with millions of dollars being put in just to produce it, and it's all wrong because they didn't even know the difference between. They didn't understand that there are 2 tribes with the same name, similar, and you got it all wrong. Like you just mixed 2 historical periods with no. So this is important to understand that Jurhum. You hear the word Jurhum, you have to ask: is this Jurhum that goes way back to Ad and Thamud, that era, or are we talking about Jurhum that came after Qahtan and during the time of Ismail alayhi salam? We don't have a lot of information about them, aside from what the Quran tells us. Aside from what the Quran tells us about Ad and Thamud specifically. And Arab al-Ariba mean the Arab that are from Yemen, and they are from the descendants of Qahtan, and I'll talk about, and you'll learn who Joktan or Qahtan is today, so you'll understand what that means. And they are the original Arabs, Arab al-Ariba. And Arab al-Musta'ariba, the Arab that were added to Arab, and al-Arib is just to say that they are original, and Musta'arib means that they were added on later, and they are the descendants of Ismail, son of Ibrahim alayhi salam, because Ismail alayhi salam was not Arab, nor was Ibrahim. They were Hebrew. Well, the word Hebrew technically started with Ibrahim alayhi salam. Some scholars, and I'll talk about that today a little bit, believe that the word Hebrew began with the man named Eber, which we'll point out today. But most likely, and this is what's accepted even today, historically, that the word Hebrew is there to describe the descendants of Ibrahim alayhi salam specifically. Ibrahim, there's no opinion, not even one opinion, that says that the Hebrews are the descendants of Isaac or Jacob at all. That doesn't exist. The Hebrews are either the descendants of Ibrahim, or the descendants of Eber, who was someone who's a little bit before him, and I'll point them out to you in a moment. So technically, the Arab who lived in Arabia, who were Musta'ariba, who were the descendants of Ismail, some were all Hebrews, and they are today. So the concept, and this is just for the conflict that exists in the Middle East, the idea that Hebrews, we agree. We have always agreed. Hebrews, for sure, will populate this area of the world, and they should always populate that area of the world. They were never told not to. It's just when you can't decide suddenly who is Hebrew and who is not. And this is something that we will get into a little bit today. So to make it a little bit simple, And this is, I'm going to get into some, there are going to be a number of these. So if you have access to the slides and you want to open it in front of you so that you can kind of go into the names with me, this may be a benefit to you because I don't know how well the visuals will be for you when it comes to these trees that I'm going to show you. So Adam alayhi salam, and then you go from Adam to Nuh alayhi salam, and then you go to Shem or Sam, right? So Sam ibn Nuh, from him, you're going to have Hud alayhi salam, who's going to who's a descendant of Sam, and then Salih, who's another descendant of Sam, and then Ibrahim, who's another descendant of Sam. They don't technically, historically, the scholars of genealogy don't believe that they are related in terms of in a vertical relation. Meaning there's no belief system, or there's no scholars who believe that Ibrahim is a descendant of Salih, or that Salih is a descendant of Hud, or that Ibrahim is a descendant of Hud. That doesn't exist. They all come from Sam ibn Nuh, but there's no belief that they actually are descended from one another. And keep that in mind because it's going to affect how we're going to understand things in a few moments. And from Ibrahim alayhi salam, obviously you have Shu'aib, and you have Ismail, and you have Muhammad. Who are we looking at here? Here we are looking at within the darker colors are the prophets who are Arab. Right? So what you're looking at right now are the prophets who are Arab. The Prophet alayhi salam, he was asked, who amongst the prophets were Arab? فقال عليه الصلاة والسلام, he's talking to Abu Dharr al-Ghifari in the hadith in Imam Tirmidhi, قال هود وصالح قال هود إسماعيل وهود وصالح وشعيب ونبيك يا أبا ذر, and your prophet, O Abu Dharr. I mean, these are the only ones that are Arab. The rest, meaning as a race of people that lived on this planet, these are the prophets who were sent to them. And we know in the Quran that every group of people had prophets sent to them. We don't know, as the Quran tells us, about all of the prophets that were sent to all of the peoples. We just don't. But we know about the Arabs. Here are the prophets that were sent to them. All right. So Imam Asma'i, he says here, والذي وقع عليه إجماعهم يا أمير المؤمنين أن أول ملك تتوج من العرب هو قحطان بن هود، وهو أول نبي مرسل بعد نوح، ونسبه لعامر الصعصعي قال إنه قحطان بن هود بن عامر بن شالخ بن أرفشخذ بن سام بن نوح. So this is an important piece of information. Al-Asma'i is a well-known historian, and he puts in his book here. This is you can see that even the way that it's written, it's an old print book, and he is talking and he's documenting some of this history for the Khalif, and he says that the first king of the Arabs was a man by the name of Qahtan. And Qahtan is the son or the descendant of Hud alayhi salam. Now, whether he's a direct descendant or one generation later is unclear, but he's a descendant of Hud. And then he gives the nasab or the genealogy of Hud alayhi salam, taken from one of the very famous historians of Arabia. His name is Amir al-Sa'sa'i, Bani Amr ibn Sa'sa'a. And he said he is Qahtan, son of Hud, son of Abir ibn Shalih ibn Arfashakh ibn Sam ibn Nuh. And I'm going to point this out to you. Why am I putting this out? Because Qahtan, if you go and you study him from a genealogical perspective, you're going to find 5 to 6 different opinions on how he goes back, like what his nasab is. Some of these ansab make Qahtan a descendant of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And usually those who say that are Orientalist scholars. Like the ones who do are scholars or scientists who are studying us from Germany or the UK or somewhere else, and I have to read this forgive me, this garbage, because they have no idea what they're talking about. They don't understand. It's names, it's repeated names, and they don't know which name it is, and then they end up making this whole mix. And to say that Qahtan is somehow descended from Ibrahim alayhi salam, it is ludicrous. It's insane. The whole problem within Arabia is these two groups that are very, very distinct and are almost unrelated at all. So I'm going to show you here. This is a genealogy tree, and some of these trees are taken from either Jewish or Christian websites, and just because in English I don't have a lot of it. I have a lot of these trees from Islamic, most of them are in Arabic. So if you look up there, so just look at the top. You'll see Nuh, and then you'll see Shem, Japheth, and Ham. So Sam, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Nuh alayhi salam. So we're gonna ignore the last 2, and we'll do that in different, maybe a different course altogether. But we're going to focus just on Sam ibn Nuh alayhi salam. And you're going to find that Sam, Arfashakh or Arfaxad that you see here, this is a very important person to know, generally speaking, because from his genealogy, Ibrahim alayhi salam will come, and all of Bani Israel, right? So all of the prophets of Bani Israel, they go back through Arfashakh. This is not Salih. In Arabic, it's Shalikh, and it's Salah in English. And then you have Eber here. So Eber, or in Arabic Abir, this gentleman, there's a lot of debate here on who this person is. Some scholars, again, Orientalist scholars, will say that they believe Hud is Abir. And this is a huge problem. Because again, it puts Ibrahim alayhi salam as one of the descendants of Hud alayhi salam, which does not, and here's and if you want to know where Ibrahim alayhi salam falls, Ibrahim alayhi salam is over here. This is Harran. This is Tariq, which is Ibrahim alayhi salam's father, and here's Abraham, and here's Harran, who is Lut alayhi salam's dad. So going back, this is Ibrahim alayhi salam's genealogy. From Ibrahim alayhi salam, obviously, we have from Hajar, we have Ismail, and then all of and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. But right now, I don't care about this part of this slide. I care about this part at the top here. So here we're trying to figure out where Qahtan ibn Hud, because the Arab, when we talk about the Arab living in Arabia, if you remember, there are three groups. The Ba'ida, those who are gone. We have no information, very little information about them. We have nothing left of them, so we can't really talk about them very much. The other two groups is the Arab al-Ariba, the Arab that come from Qahtan, from Yemen, and then the Arab Musta'riba, or the descendants of Ismail. So those are two distinct groups. So understanding their genealogy makes a difference in how this whole story ends up being told. So Eber, which is one of the grandfathers or forefathers of Ibrahim alayhi salam, some will call him Hud in certain texts if you study it. And this is, to me, one of the biggest mistakes. Abd is absolutely not Hud alayhi salam. What we do believe is that Hud alayhi salam is the son of Abd, and this is why I use this slide, because Qahtan ibn Hud ibn Abd, and this is one of probably the most, in my opinion, probably one of the, if not. It's a good estimate of who Hud alayhi salam, who alayhi salam actually is. So we believe that he may be here, that Hud alayhi salam may be over there, in this over here, because we have Joktan, which is what Qahtan is, right? So that works nicely. Another problem, or another possibility, is that Hud alayhi salam is the son or a descendant of Aram, or as known to you in Surah Al-Fajr, Iram. When we say Iram Adati al-Imad, Iram, this is Iram over here, right? We know for sure that Ad and Thamud came from this, was descendant from Iram. We know that for sure. The difference of opinion is whether Hud alayhi salam is a descendant of Eber over here, and then Qahtan came from him, versus this is not accurate, and Iram, and then you have Iwas here, and the son of Iwas is Hud, and then Hud had Qahtan, so that there's a mistake in this genealogy. Either way, it doesn't make that much of a difference in the long run. And you're wondering, well, why? That makes a big difference. No, it doesn't make a difference, because what it ends up doing at the end, and I'll explain that to you, is it ends up absolutely disengaging or disassociating the genealogy of Qahtan, son of Hud, regardless of Hud, where it's coming from, and Ismail, son of Ibrahim alayhi salam. It puts them, in terms of their background, as separated as probably humanly possible. It's very rare that people only add up somewhere with Sam ibn Nuh, right? Or at, for example, Eber ibn Shalih ibn Arfashakhat ibn Sam ibn Nuh. This is very far away. People sitting in this room, 99% of people sitting in this room, connect way before this, like way down by generations upon generations, by hundreds of years. It's very rare that two people, and this is probably the farthest away relation between human beings on the planet, if they only meet somewhere up here within this genealogy tree. So when we're talking about Hud alayhi salam, either Hud alayhi salam is here, and it's Qahtan ibn Hud ibn Abir ibn Shalih ibn Al-Fashakhat ibn Sham ibn Sam ibn Nuh, or it's somewhere here. It's Hud ibn Iwas ibn Iram ibn Sam ibn Nuh. I think most likely it's the second one. The way I don't think Al-Asma'i got it fully correct. He got the fact that Qahtan is the son of Hud and they come from Sam. I don't think it's the son of Abir. I think it's Iram and it's Iwas, and then Hud goes here, and then you have Qahtan, and then all the tribes basically descend from that. And here's just an example of the website that you have for Qahtan, and the number of different opinions of what his genealogy is. And the one that I put in red for you is Qahtan ibn Hud ibn Abdullah ibn al-Khalud ibn Ad ibn Iwas ibn Iram ibn Sam ibn, or Aus, either way, ibn Sam ibn Nuh. And this is an opinion that most of my teachers believe to be the truth. And you don't have to read all this, and I don't want to translate all of this either. I just want to put it up there as one of the... So those are the two possibilities for Hud alayhi salam. He's either connected, meaning Ibrahim's genealogy and Hud's genealogy. Either they meet at Abir, son of Shalih ibn al-Fashakh ibn Sam ibn Nuh, or they meet at Sam ibn Nuh, meaning Ibrahim goes through Abir ibn Shalih ibn al-Fashakh, and then Hud goes through Iwas, through Iram, and then Sam ibn Nuh. Regardless, these two people who are their descendants don't really connect until way up the tree, at as high as the tree can go for most people. And as we know that that level of genealogy, that high up, there's always a little bit of difference of opinion. There's some things that we know for sure and some things we don't. What do we know for sure from the Arab is that the Qahtaniyin and the Adnaniyin, right, the descendants of Ismail, aren't related. And they don't come together unless, and their marriages amongst each other were documented and celebrated. It was a big deal because they didn't make these, they didn't mix for a long time. And there was a lot of animosity between them. This is where it comes from. It comes from the fact that they're not related. Not that being related was a reason for people not to fight in Arabia by any means. No, that probably is more. But it caused a different type of animosity. There's one thing to fight your cousin. There's something different to racially to see them with a racial eye. Right, to see them to be lesser in general as people, and that's where the problem kind of came with this. Just because Hud alayhi salam is always referred to through Iram and Al-Ahqaf and Rab al-Ahqaf and talking about Hijr. So whenever Hud and Salih are talked about, they're always talked about separately in the Quran, even in a way where they are kind of removed from Banu Israel's prophets. So you find Ibrahim and then you find Ismail and they talk about Ishaq and Yaqub and they go on and Musa and Isa, and then you find Hud and Salih always put aside. And the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about Iram, He actually brought up the name in the Quran. So if you think about it in Surah Al-Fajr, you find that Iram Adat al-Imad, the word Iram was not, it's not really required. Like you didn't need that word to establish anything, aside from establishing a similar genealogy for someone or for something or for some group, as if it's achieving a similar genealogy for, or a similar, or a grandfather that they all had in common, a common grandfather for the Arab. Allahu A'lam. And it's not my opinion specifically, it's more the opinions of the scholars that I take from, so not mine specifically. Really, I can't take credit for it myself. All right. So Hud alayhi salam, and we know that Qahtan is descendant of Hud alayhi salam. We've established that piece, at least to a certain degree of clarity. And this is the so if you have access to it on go home today and take a look at it. What you're going to read here are important. So the word Saba, you see the name Saba? Yeah, so that Saba, when you think about Saba, that Saba is one of the descendants. So Saba ibn Yashjub ibn Ya'rub ibn Qahtan, right? And Ya'rub ibn Qahtan, which is this gentleman over here, was one of the great kings of Arabia. And we have documented like khutab for this person. And there's and most of these early names were muwahhideen, by the way. Like most of these early, like Qahtan and Ya'rub and Yashjub and Saba, these people were muwahhideen. I mean, they were people who believed in La ilaha illallah. They were descendants of Hud alayhi salam. They come from a genealogy of prophecy. It was only when things obviously got a little bit more branched out. So when you hear the name Kahlan, for example, you know there's a Qahtani. Himyar, which is a large kingdom that existed in Yemen for many, many centuries. Himyar is a large kingdom of Arab, and who lived in Yemen, and they're the descendants of Qahtan ibn Hud alayhi salam. For example, so Lakhm, which we're going to talk about specifically, Jafna, we're going to talk about them specifically because they're the Manadir and the Ghasasina, which are important aspects. Al-Azd is a large batan min butun al-Arab, and they're called Azd Shanu'a because Nasr Shanu'a is one of the names of the. So everything in yellow are just very well established names. What I want you to know here is the following. So go down here a little bit. You see these two names? All right, you see them? Yeah. So Khazraj and Aus, ibn Harith ibn Tha'laba, and you go up a little bit here, and they come from Mazin al-Azd, right? So the two tribes in Medina, the Khazraj and Aus, are Azdiyin. They're from Al-Azd min Mazin, from Mazin. Of course, aside from Mazin, so Nasr Shanu'a, for example, on the other side, go down a little bit, you'll see someone that you know. You see that? You gonna read that? Dos, right? Abu Hurairah, where he come from? He comes from Dos, right? Abdurrahman al-Sakhr al-Dawsi. So Dos is a very large tribe, and they're related technically to Al-Aus al-Khazraj. But how many generations do you have to go back before they connect? right? They connected Al-Azd, which is far away, which is why they lived afar. So imagine now when we're talking about, when I was showing you Usam ibn Nuh, and you think these people who are considered, you're considering now, they didn't consider themselves to be related. They were so far away. We consider them a little bit related, but imagine now if you don't really connect until Sam ibn Nuh, or maybe one generation or two generations after Sam ibn Nuh. For example, Madhij is a very well-known tribe that populated the middle of Arabia for a very long time. Who else can I put out here for you that's going to be important? We're gonna come back to this for a couple of times throughout this course. Like every once in a while, I'll talk to you about someone. I'll just go back and say, take a look. Where do these tribes? And then you'll see it, and you're like, okay. Yeah. Because when we talk about Qudaa, for example, in the future, this will become something that'll make sense to you. When you understand where Qudaa stands in a lot of these problems, you understand why they stand in the way they do in a lot of the problems that actually occur. Okay, so look here. You see this name? Khuza'a. Right, Khuza'a is a big tribe, and Khuza'a plays a pretty big role within the Prophet ﷺ's history. And their father is Amr ibn Luhay, so keep that in mind as well, because Amr ibn Luhay is an important figure as well. So these people, who later on, of course, they turn into all these different tribes. These tribes are going to have a role, and how they function in Arabia is going to be of a certain degree of importance. Yeah. Very, very different, yeah. But it's important to understand that it's not just them. This goes beyond that. It goes way beyond just Mecca and Medina. It goes into every aspect of Arabian life. People in Arabia, the way they identified themselves was where they belonged within this tree. This tree was the passport. This tree was memorized. It was known by heart. This is how you identified yourself. If you walked in, who are you? You're going to point out, I am Fulan ibn, you start going up. So you see Kinda over here. Kinda is a very large kingdom. Imr al-Qais, we're going to talk about Imr al-Qais as a poet, and his father was the king of Kinda. Fulan ibn Kinda ibn Ufair ibn Adi ibn Harith ibn Murrah ibn Udad ibn Zayd ibn Yashjub ibn Akhas, you know. Or you just point, Ana min abna'ika Zayd ibn Kahlan. All right, you're known. Sometimes you don't have to point out every single person in your lineage. You have to point out, I'm a part of this tribe. And then who's your father? And then you go back a couple of generations. Khalas. That's your passport. If you weren't able to offer that, then you were going to be either killed or enslaved. You couldn't be trusted. If you weren't able to offer your lineage, or if you offered the lineage that wasn't accurate, people knew. Like, you think looking at all this, you can make something up. You couldn't. Not even to a common person. Like, forget about Abu Bakr as-Siddiq anhu, like laughing at you when you throw out a name that was wrong because he knows your family more than you do. But even a common person, if you throw out a lineage and it's not accurate, they know. Because this is all they know. This is how they exist. They know where people live. They know where the miyah are. Miyah, when we say ma fulan and ma fulan, it's the water. People lived beside water, and any gathering of water belonged to a certain tribe, and that was ma bani fulan and ma bani fulan. And if you're going to go access it, you have to. It started from the time of Ismail, right? When Jurhum came and they wanted to Zamzam. Now there's water. There wasn't water in that area. Mecca had no water. No one cared for it. So that's why it was left throughout history. After the Kaaba, after Ayyam, Adam and Nuh and Hud, the Kaaba got forgotten. But no one went and populated that area. And that's the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there was no water. Why would they? And then suddenly water came out and now people are going to live. And now Jurhum comes, and Ismail grows up, he gets married, and now people are populating this area. And then, of course, they build the Kaaba, and it becomes a place. Before that, any place with no water is not going to be populated by anybody. Why would they? You can't survive in the desert without it. All right. So these are just some names, and this is the same thing in Arabic for you. And I don't need to go through any details for you here. I think this is pretty much the same. So the opposite side is the tribe of Adnan. I don't need to go through detail of this because we know for a fact, without needing to go through the genealogy, that Adnan is the descendant of Ismail alayhi salam, maybe third or fourth generation after Ismail, son of Ibrahim. So the Adnaniyun, so when you study Orientalist work, you'll find they'll use the term Qahtanites as a lineage of Arabs. And then another lineage that they'll use, or another wording, will either be Ishmaelites or Adnanites. And in both you'll find them in the words, and they're the same thing. When he says Ishmaelites or Adnanites, it's exactly the same thing, because we don't really have any, like the descendants of Ismail alayhi salam all connect at Adnan, and there's nothing beyond that we have any information of. And the nasab of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, which is, as you can see in green, goes back accurately to Adnan, descendant of Ismail alayhi salam, Ishmael. Beyond that, the nasab becomes unclear. Like, we have it, but we don't know. It's not that we don't think it's correct. We just don't know if there's someone's missing. If there's maybe if we missed one of the fathers or one of the people in the actual nasab. But to Adnan, we know it very, very accurately. And of course, I think it's important to know his background, alayhi salatu wasalam. This one is a little bit smaller. I didn't realize how small it was going to be. Poof. Oh, okay, this is a better one. This is bigger. Right, perfect. So when you look at this, for example, so when you see him, alayhi salatu wasalam, I want you to see. So this is Ma'ad, this is Nizar, and this is Mudar. So Nizar had two sons. He had Mudar and he had Rabi'ah. And these are the two big butun of the Adnanites. The two big large grouping of tribes were the Mudariyun and Rabi'ah. They didn't like each other either. So there was a lot of animosity there, but most of it was competition. There was a certain degree of competition that came with the Mudar. The Prophet ﷺ in Mudar, right? Where do you think Musaylim al-Kadhdhab is from? That makes sense? So a lot of these stories, once you start following this, is like, oh, okay, that was what. Look, the history of human, the story of human history is not that complicated. It follows the same little diseases of the heart that exist everywhere. It's envy, it's competition, it's hatred, it's all that. It's the same stuff. It doesn't really, it's arrogance, it's vanity. So it's not that hard to sometimes understand why things happen. Musaylimah became a big deal, and because no, it never happened. You didn't really have like a very well-known name from Qahtan who called for their own prophecy, because they didn't have prophets in their history. Like not since Hud alayhi salam, which goes back a lot. Adnan is way after Qahtan, by the way. In terms of timeline, Qahtan has been there for a long time. Adnan came in later, but they became the two names because the descendants started to identify with them. It's whatever people identify with that we end up learning the names and understanding the lineages. But Qahtan, in terms of time, in terms of the historical timing, was way before that, because Qahtan was the son of Hud. Ibrahim would come years later, like a couple of generations later, before Ibrahim was even born. And then Ibrahim and Ismail, then Adnan came a couple of generations. So there's at least maybe 200 to 300 years difference between Qahtan and Ya'rub bin Qahtan, and then the Adnanites coming into Arabia, which also has another problem, where the people who descend from Qahtan believe that they have more right they're more native to the land. They're the indigenous to this land, not the Ishmaelites or the Adnanites. So there's a feeling also of ownership here that's different. That you're much newer, and you descend from Ismail. Yes, he's a prophet and everything, and good for you, but he wasn't Arab to begin with. So that affected how people would see one another. So that's one thing. And then from Mudar, you have two big branches. You have Ilyas, and from Ilyas, the Prophet ﷺ comes, right, and Quraysh. And then you have Aylan, or what we know as Qais Aylan. Qais Aylan. Keep that in mind, because Qais Aylan is a huge group of people. And from them, a lot of those, you're going to hear these names a lot. You're going to hear about Ghatafan that come from them, for example. You're going to hear about Thaqif. Remember, where does Thaqif live? Right? Ta'if. Like the big rivalry that existed between Mecca and Ta'if came from the rivalry between the descendants of Ilyas and Qais Aylan. So they're from Thaqif. And then the Prophet ﷺ is from Quraysh, who comes from Ilyas. So there's a rivalry that goes back quite a long time. They're not that close, and this rivalry was real, and that's why they never actually worked together at all, almost in any of the wars that occurred. And then you can see where Hawazin, right? So Thaqif comes kind of from Hawazin. Hawazin is the bigger. Abs and Dhubiyan, all of these are, and we're going to talk about wars that occurred in Arabia. You're going to find that Abs and Dhubiyan are two well-known tribes that are cousin tribes. They're going to fight for a very long time. They're on this side of the map. And that's pretty much all I need you to know now. We're going to come back to these a couple of times as we go through things, just to make sure that you have a good understanding or good feeling of it. On this side, when you come from Ilyas, this is where you find Tamim, which is one of the biggest tribes in Arabia. Till this day, Tamim is a huge tribe in Arabia. And people, if you have friends from parts of Saudi Arabia, and their last name will be a Tamimi, and they still actually identify with this tribe that is now thousands of years old. Easily. Kinana is an important name to know, because Kinana is the umbrella tribe that Quraysh belongs to, and a lot of the tribes that existed around Mecca and within Mecca belong to Kinana, and they constantly, like Murrah and Bakr and Ghifar. All of these tribes, one way or the other, fall under Kinana, and Kinana has always been the tribe that was either living in Mecca or surrounding Mecca or defending Mecca or involved in it one way or the other. What else would I point out to you here? So, see Bani Shayban. So Hanifa is where Musaylim al-Kadhab comes from, and he's on, of course, Rabi'a's side, and you have Bani Shayban. Bani Shayban, at some point in the Prophet ﷺ's life, he'll walk up to them and during the time of Hajj, and he will speak to them. Right? He'll speak to them about supporting him, and they're very nice people and they're very good people, but they don't take him ﷺ because they live in the eastern part and they're very close to Persia, and they couldn't end up they didn't want to get in trouble with Persia. They would later accept Islam and become a strong tribe that supported Islam, but it took them a long time. Because they're from Rabi'a, it was a problem. The Prophet ﷺ wasn't sure to approach them to begin with because of how the distance between them and the rivalry. But when he did, he almost got it, but didn't get as far as he would have liked to, ﷺ, because of where they were living at the time. Most of these tribes that you're reading, and this is another Khuza'a here that we're going to talk about. And we're going to differentiate between this Khuza'a and the other Khuza'a later because it's going to matter. Again, historians who talk about Sirah, they use the Khuza'a for this. They use the same one, and they're not the same. They're two Khuza'as. They're very different. One of them is Adnanite, one of them Qahtanite, and they didn't agree, and they actually there were wars between them at some point in history as well. But when you look at this, a lot of these tribes are the tribes that would show up for Hajj. A lot of these tribes are the ones that showed up for Hajj. Why? Because they are descendants of Ibrahim ﷺ, who called for Hajj the first time. So that culture continued with them. If you go back to the previous ones, this one over here, a lot of these tribes didn't. Most of these tribes didn't show up for Hajj. They didn't care for it, right? They didn't care for it because that wasn't something that existed strongly within their background. So that's why when you study Hajj, not all of Arabia came for Hajj. If all Arabia came for Hajj, it would be worse than it is today. It would be more than millions and millions. So it was never like that because a lot of these didn't show up for Hajj. However, they still had a certain degree of respect for Mecca because it was seen as the sanctuary for the Arab themselves, and they still respected certain aspects of Ashhur al-Hurum and the Hurma of the Haram. But really, for them, it was all about the game of Asnam. It was because the concept of Asnam started with them, and I'll talk about that. And a lot of them were very big they were polytheists. They turned into polytheists eventually. Over time, they turned to polytheists, and their polytheism became very much embedded in rock Asnam. And because the Kaaba was the center of religion, they wanted it there. So they're the ones who started to pollute this whole concept. The Kaaba didn't have Asnam as far as it was during the time of Ibrahim and Ismail, and obviously Adnan and Nizar and Mudar. It wasn't there. And then Amr ibn Luhay brought it in, and then it became a big thing amongst the Qahtanis. And then to stop wars, they started to accept it. And this is how this happened. It happened through a cultural shift that existed in one group that affected the Kaaba itself, which ended up affecting these tribes, the Adnanite tribes, and them taking on Asnam for themselves as well, because it became an issue of fakhr, of this competition. What fueled a lot of what happened in Arabia was this extremely bizarre sense of competitiveness that existed amongst the Arab. Now, I don't know if this same degree of competitiveness exists all across the world, but I know that it existed then, and I know that it still exists today. And I have uncles who are in their 70s. If we sit down and play cards, we will scream at each other as if there's no tomorrow. There are people who are over 70 years old, and the competitiveness that they have inside of, I've seen this growing up in any part of Arabia. There's this feel of competition that exists inside the Arabi's heart that I don't know if it's the same. It may be the same everywhere. I don't know. But I know for sure that it's something very, very obvious and very, very clear. And if you imagine it happening on a scale that is defining your identity from a genealogical perspective, like you're trying to hold the ground of your ancestors. Like you're trying to prove that your background, this group is superior to this one. And then once you're done doing that and you're comfortable with that, then you come to this group and you wonder, well, which button here is more superior? And then when you're done that, you go down, and then it just keeps on going down and more and more and more and more and more. But when needed, all of this comes back again. So when the two sons of Quraysh fight, they're fighting, but then if you bring someone from a different tribe, it all goes back up again. Well, no, I'm fighting with him, but he's my cousin, and that guy's from I don't know him. And a lot of the fuel that happened in Arabia came from this. Okay. And this is the nasab of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do I have it here clearly, or? What did you have from the last time? Okay, so look at it. So Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abd al-Muttalib ibn Hashim ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay ibn Kilab ibn Murrah ibn Ka'b ibn Lu'ay ibn Ghalib ibn Fihr ibn Malik ibn Nadr ibn Kinada ibn Khuzayl ibn Mutrib ibn Ilyas ibn Mudar ibn Zar ibn Ad ibn Adnan. So this is a genealogy you should memorize. This is his name, alayhi salatu wasalam, going back. And it's important because you will start to learn where people kind of branch off and how they're related to him, alayhi salatu wasalam. Him being, whether we like it or not, even if you're a non-religious person attending this course from a historical perspective, whether you like it or not, he became the center of Arabia, alayhi salatu wasalam. He became the center of this whole story. This story was existing in a very different way before he came. And when he came and he brought Islam and he changed certain things, he became the center. So understanding how everything kind of connects to him, alayhi salatu wasalam, becomes of extreme importance to understand the history of the region altogether. And we're going to come back to this part later, next session, because we're going to understand how Quraysh exists. Because Quraysh has their own little problems on the inside. Understanding why those problems exist makes it much easier to understand Islam. But now you understand why some of the tribes, later on we'll talk about the tribes, why they were quick to accept Islam and some of them weren't quick. And it comes back to this, or it comes back to a certain rivalry that existed between them and someone else. All right. You got through this. Bravo alaikum. So first thing, is Hud Eber? So most likely not. I don't, because this is an important question. If you end up becoming more interested in this topic and you want to study more, and they start, and those who are talking to make Hud to be Abir, no, Hud alayhi salam is not Abir. He's either his son or a descendant of him, or Hud alayhi salam, which is more likely to me. And most likely, Hud is from the lineage of Iram, son of Shem, son of Nuh, and the Qahtanites are from his lineage. This is my opinion on the matter. This is what I think is most likely. This is what the majority of scholars believe. But if you were to look at it, that Hud is the son of Abir, I think it's still not a problem. Like, it doesn't change anything really in the story. Like, still, the Adnanites and the Qahtanites aren't really connecting through in their ancestry until almost just a few descendants after Nuh alayhi salam, which is the farthest away two people can be. Now, what maybe you're not following here with me is that this aspect of genealogy is unique. It doesn't exist elsewhere in the world. At least it didn't exist like at that time. Maybe today is different, obviously, with massive immigrations and ikhtilat and sab and stuff. And now it's a very different landscape. But back then, if you went to India, or you went to parts of Africa, or you went to North America, you went to Europe, people who were living in the same area, speaking, mind you, most importantly, speaking the same language, had similar genealogies. And if they were a little bit disconnected, they connected 4 to 5 ancestors into their genealogy, not 100 ancestors up to Sam ibn Nuh alayhi salam. No, that didn't exist. That was not tolerated anywhere. But it existed uniquely in Arabia. This is why I'm wasting your time listening to this stuff, because we don't find this example somewhere else. It's very unique to this part of the world. They spoke the same language, but they were very, very distant in terms of how they were related to one another. That means that they had different cultures, and we know that. We know that the Adnanites and Qahtanites had very different cultures. For example, when we talk about Wa'd al-Banat, most of the Adnanites did not do that. Like the idea of someone burying his daughter. No, only in the other group did that actually occur. So Quraysh never did that. Quraysh never did this. It was not something that they did. It was unfathomable for them to bury their own daughters because of certain differences in the culture. When it came to Hajj, and it came to certain rituals in terms of marriage and in terms of warfare, in terms of wealth and riba. These things, the Qahtanites were never involved heavily in that, but the Adnanites were very heavily involved in riba for a long time. And this is important to understand. Are the Qahtanites sons of Hud? Yes, most likely yes. That is the common belief, and that's what makes most sense. Are the Qahtanites sons of Abraham? No. Why do some Orientalists say this? I'll show you why. Because they think this is the guy. See, Joktan and Jokshan, same thing. So they look at it that way. Just a similar, small little thing. Okay, he must be. No, it doesn't add up. Qahtan existed before Ibrahim by far. It was way before Ibrahim. We know he was way before Ibrahim. Or else, how did Jurhum is descended from Qahtan? How did Ismail alayhi salam marry into a tribe that was descended from his father from another wife later? It doesn't add up at all. But then people who are talking about genealogy who mix up names ends up causing like huge mistakes and huge problems. But just to give you an example of where that would happen. Some people do. Some people know. A lot of people know. Yeah. Yeah, especially those who are part of the Prophet ﷺ's lineage. They know for sure. They can count it back name by name. I have a lot of my teachers were like that. All you have to do is take it back to the Prophet ﷺ, and the rest is pretty easy, right? If you can get it back to, for example, every family name that ends with every Rifa'i, right? Every Zuhuri, all these are Ashraf or Sada. They can count their genealogy back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and at that point, it doesn't. The rest of it is just it's automatic. And some people don't need to do that. You can just count yourself back to certain tribes. For example, just as Palestinians all descend from Banu Zayd. And Banu Zayd are one of the Butun of the Adnanite Arabs who immigrated after the first during the times of Umayya Khilafah. They immigrated over to Palestine. There are people still obviously living there, but a lot of them immigrated from Arabia and they went back to live there, which is why Imam Shafi'i was born in Gaza, because people would immigrate to Palestine because they're Hebrews, they're descendants of Ismail and Ibrahim, so they go back to where a lot of them came from to begin with. So the majority of Palestinians come from Banu Zayd, and most of them are Banu Zayd كلهم عدنانيين. But regardless of that, that's a whole different discussion to begin with. But a lot of this stuff is trackable. Like it's easy to track. You may not be able to call about your specific lineage specifically, which is no big deal. But if you wanted to, you could. Like it's not that hard. But you just need to know what group of people do you belong to and what tribes existed in that area, and then that's pretty much it. And there is a difference. Like the Adnanites were a little bit lighter in skin, and the Qahtanites were a little bit darker in skin. And back then, this was a way to kind of know people. It wasn't a racial profiling. It didn't matter. But that difference was the way the nose looked and the ways the eyes looked. There were certain differences. That's why the Prophet ﷺ would tell some of his the Sahaba who wanted to marry into Khazraj and Aus, like, go take a look at the daughters. Make sure you see her before. Like the idea before for a man to look at the woman before they got married didn't exist for the Qahtanites at all. That was not a part of their culture whatsoever. If you looked at her and you saw her before you, he would murder you. They're not going to get married. You're not going to marry her. He's going to kill you right then and there. So they didn't accept that. But the Prophet ﷺ had to change some of this culture because there were differences in the way they looked even. So he would get to take a look first, because you may end up, this is going to matter. People of similar background, similar lineage, it doesn't need, because people look similarly. So there's no really, the mother is capable of judging, he'll be fine. But then when people's faces change a lot and there's a genealogy that's very different, you require the person to actually verify. This is why these things happen. Like, you can't really appreciate fully the story with understanding kind of where some of these things came from to begin with. So is Hud an ancestor of Ibrahim? Most likely not. There's no evidence in the Quran for that. There's no evidence from the Prophet ﷺ for that. None of the Arab historians or the Nasaba, the Arab who talked about lineages, ever even suggested that. The only people I've seen suggest that were Orientalists. And again, I can't tell you how little I like their work on this stuff. They don't seem to know what they're talking about most of the time, if not all the time. The Adnanites are descendants of Ibrahim. This is very known. And regardless, Qahtanites and Adnanites are quite distant genealogically, regardless of exactly how Hud connects to Sam ibn Nuh, regardless of whether it's the first option or the second option, doesn't make that much of a difference. People are still very distanced from each other. All right. So Jurhum are from the lineage of Qahtan for sure. They existed before Ibrahim and Ismail. We don't exactly know how they fit into the lineage perfectly. Like, I can't show you how the first Jurhum, or the second Jurhum. The first Jurhum is with Ad and Thamud. I don't know exactly anything much about them. But the second Jurhum, that came during the time of Ismail, that existed obviously before, which is a different tribe, I don't know exactly how they connect into the lineages of Qahtan. I don't know. But we know that they are for sure. The Manadhira. So this is important. These are just important names, because we're going to cover these things a little bit. We're going to talk about them a little bit more in the future. The Manadhira are a group of Arab that are from the lineage of Qahtan, and they're called Jafna. If you go back to the lineage tree, you'll find a yellow thing called Jafna, and that's where the Manadhira come from. The Ghasasina are also, Lakhm, forgive me, I'm mixing up. So the Manadhira are from Lakhm, and then the Ghasasina are from Jafna, and they're both from Qahtan, and they occupy the northern part of Arabia, almost right down the middle. Like they divided Arabia, and one group is to the east, and they are allies with the Furs and the Persians, and one group is to the west, and they're allies with the Roman Empire, and they made almost like a dam, like a sad, So if you were living in Arabia and you wanted to go north, you had to go through one of them, and both of them are Qahtanites, and both of them had strong ties with two different empires in the land, which made it impossible for the Arab to ever hope for some degree of proper governance and independence. The Prophet ﷺ's biggest obstacle to establishing some form of political governance in Arabia was not the Persians or the Romans. It was the Ghassasina and the Manazira. They were the problem. Actually, the kings of Himyar, so Himyar also lineage from Qahtan and ruled South Arabia for periods of time. They were easier and they were quicker to get on board with things. Interestingly enough, it was the Manazira and Ghassasina who weren't interested because they were holding off, like they were benefiting from the riches of the land, and they were basically the correspondents. Same thing today. Same thing today. Yeah, they live in a country in the Middle East. One of them is either they're with the Russian and Chinese, or they're with the NATO, and they all have, what they have in common is that they suck the resources of their people dry, and they leave people with nothing. So it has not changed that much, just so you know. Like this going back 2,000 years ago, pretty much the same problem that we had back then. The Prophet ﷺ's biggest problem was that when we talk about, for example, Mu'tah wasn't with the Romans specifically. It was with their representatives. Those are the ones who wanted to end it. And I'll talk to you about this, inshallah, in some degree of detail. Kingdom, which is another, why do I put these out? 1, 2, 3, 4, because these are the 4 major kingdoms that existed just around the time he was being born, alayhi salatu wasalam. So the Manazira, the Ghassasina, Himyar, and then Kinda. And Kinda is unclear whether they are from Qahtan or Adnan, but most likely a descendant of Himyar, and they went over to the east a little bit of Arabia, and I'll explain. I'm going to talk to you about them specifically because there's a few stories that matter, and they ruled Mid-Arabia for a period of time. What is the trend here? The trend here is that the majority of kingdoms were not Adnanites. The majority of kingdoms were from Qahtan. Why? Because they were there before. They had been there for a long time before, long enough to establish kingdoms. The Adnanites who came a bit later weren't able to establish such strong kingdoms. What they were able to establish were cities, which is why Mecca became a big deal. Because there's a difference between a kingdom and a city, as weird as that may sound to you right now in terms of how the world exists. A kingdom is when, so Sheikh al-Qabila, the head of the tribe, is just called Sheikh al-Qabila or Sayyid al-Qawm, where he is governing only his people. You're called a king if you're governing other tribes as well. If you govern a tribe that is not yours, you are now called a king. You're no longer Sheikh al-Qabila or Sayyid al-Qawm or Sharif or whatever, you become a king. So that's how Arab used this term. So you had these kingdoms where the Manadira, they have a king, and the Khazasina have a king, and Himyar has a king, and Kinda has a king, because they weren't just governing their own tribes, they were governing smaller tribes and other tribes that existed around them. They didn't mean that they had cities. No, they had places where their tribes lived, and all of the, they would set their tents, and areas that they would move within, because most of them were nomads. Most of them were not civilized. They didn't build cities. They moved along. But this area where these different tribes are moving are under the ruling of this one king. And this king usually is very rich because he takes taxes from everyone. But they didn't necessarily establish cities. Some of them did, but I'm saying the majority of them didn't. The Adnanites who weren't able to establish specific kingdoms were at least able to establish cities. And establishing cities was a little bit of a deal breaker. And changed a lot of things. And of course, there's other groups living in Arabia that we haven't talked about yet. So you have Jews living in Arabia and you have Christians living in Arabia who come from different lineages altogether. Some of them are Arab who converted, and some of them are actually not. They are people who are Hebrews, like Jews, descendants of Ishaq, or Christians who are descended from a couple, but they came in and they learned the language and they lived there for a certain period of time. And we're going to talk about them, inshallah, a little bit in the next session. So that's for today. I'm going to end with that, inshallah, just because today was heavy on lineages and genealogies. Good for you. You got through it, so amazing. Next time, we'll continue a little bit more. I'll draw out the map for you in a little bit more detail so you have an idea of where people meet. So we'll take a look. And also here's Tamim, for example, existing up here. I can show you how the different tribes kind of moved and situated. And what you ended up with is you didn't end up getting the breakdown that you would think is clean. I mean, you didn't get the Qahtanites in one area and the Adnanites. No, you got this big mix. Because they're nomads, because the Arabs they didn't sit in one place. They kept on moving, kept on immigrating, but they couldn't leave that early spot up there. See the Ghassasinids up here and the Lakhms, the Manazir up here, closing up the ability to kind of leave. And then people moved around a lot in here. And you have obviously Kinda over here, and you have Himyar over here. So we'll go over some of these tribes and kind of where they lived, because it's going to matter to you to know when you understand where the Quraysh was, you understand where Yathrib, Medina was, understand what was surrounding them. It becomes a little bit easier to imagine why these struggles existed. I'll end with that. Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullahu khair wa barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.